A grandfather who has always helped his grandson with everything begins to realize that the boy, now an adult, has no time for him. On his last birthday alone, he writes a letter and buys a special gift. But before he can give it to him, something tragic happens. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, tell us where you are listening to our story from, and leave a like, because this story may be exactly what you needed to hear today. The setting sun, dyeing the sky with warm, soft colors, seemed to announce another night of silence and memories. There, in that modest house full of memories, João settled into his rocking chair, feeling his joints complain of age and the imminent cold of dawn. In his hands he held a small gift, wrapped in dark blue paper, decorated with a carefully aligned red bow. That packaging, so simple yet so careful, held not just an object, but a piece of life that would never return. To Miguel, with love, your grandfather, João, the label read. Each letter was written in his firm handwriting, the result of years of practicing in his primary school notebooks. The sigh that fell from his lips carried a weight that was hard to describe. The soft creaking of the rocking chair, synchronized with the beating of his heart, created a kind of melancholy melody, as if each crack in the wood were a fragment of memory, a call from the past that insisted on resurfacing. João thought about Miguel. For him, it was not enough to have him just as a grandson. Miguel was the future, the reason he believed his life would be worth living. He remembered the boy running around the room, his childish laughter echoing off the walls, infecting even the most serious of adults. He remembered the times they went fishing together, feeling the sun warm his back as the river flowed gently. He remembered when Miguel learned to ride a bike at the age of 7, falling countless times until finally he was able to pedal confidently. In each of these memories, João saw love. He saw hope. He saw a meaning to keep moving forward. However, life does not bend to our will. As the years went by, Miguel grew up, and the abyss created by modernity and different paths became increasingly difficult to overcome. As a teenager, the boy began to avoid family gatherings, preferring the refuge of a closed room, where the computer and cell phone became his constant companions. The easy smile of yesteryear was replaced by an eye roll whenever João tried to start a conversation. The grandson, who once delighted in fishing stories, now had no patience for stories about the past. João understood that it was natural for younger people to seek their own paths. He tried not to feel resentful. Still, every gesture of ingratitude, even if unconscious, was a small blow to his heart. Remembering the day Miguel ignored him in public, pretending not to hear his grandfather's call while talking to friends, João felt a pang of sadness. That silent rejection hurt. But he never complained about anything. He believed that love, by itself, would overcome indifference. When Miguel reached adulthood, the gaps already seemed irreversible. João's calls went to voicemail, and messages took days to be answered, if they were answered at all. Thus, the gift that João had bought, certain that it would be a milestone in Miguel's life, ended up relegated to a dark corner of the drawer, as forgotten as the old man himself felt. The idea for the pocket watch came from an old inspiration. His own grandfather had given him a similar watch when he was a boy, talking about the value of time and how every second should be enjoyed. João wanted to perpetuate this symbolism, giving Miguel something that would remind him of the preciousness of each moment. The silver watch had delicate details on the lid, and inside, Miguel's name was engraved, accompanied by a simple dedication. To Miguel, with love, your grandfather, John. He imagined his grandson opening that gift, a sparkle of surprise in his eyes, perhaps a hug and a "thank you, Grandpa," that would make him feel alive, needed, loved. But that never came to fruition. Months passed and Miguel always said he was too busy, Commitments, work, friends, parties, dating, and so many other activities that arise in the dynamics of a modern young adult. Even so, Joan did not lose hope of delivering the gift to her personally. I wanted to see his reaction, share a moment alone, tell the story of that watch, talk about the grandfather who once gave him something similar. Maybe he would even mention the smell of where he grew up, the memories of a time when people would sit on the porch and talk, but life was moving fast and opportunities always seemed to slip away. Then that night, the phone rang. At first, John's heart was filled with anticipation. Maybe it was Miguel, finally, returning the last call his grandfather had made. But no, the voice on the other end of the line was not his grandson's. It brought no warmth, no affection, much less the chance for a reconnection that Joan so longed for. It was the cold voice of a doctor or a nurse, he couldn't tell for sure, informing him that Miguel had suffered a serious accident. John's mind refused to process the information. A numbness ran through his body, from head to toe, making his hands sweat and his heart beat wildly. With difficulty, he managed to write down the address of the hospital, staggered to the room, picked up the present with the red bow, and left in a hurry. The car ride seemed like an eternity. Every red light, every wrong turn, everything seemed to conspire against his despair. He held the gift in his lap, talking to himself in an inaudible prayer, as if he believed that the box could contain not only a watch, but some magic formula to save Miguel. When he arrived at the hospital, the smell of disinfectant, the muffled screams, the hustle and bustle of the corridors had enveloped him like a suffocating wave. A nurse pointed to the room where Miguel was. Only then did John realize that he was holding the package so tightly that he had almost torn the paper. Trying to contain the trembling in his legs, he walked down that long corridor, which seemed to have no end. Outside, the night was getting darker and darker, as if anticipating the tragedy that was about to happen. When he finally reached the door, he found a doctor with a somber expression. There was no need to say much. Miguel had not survived the accident. Joan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He didn't scream. He didn't kick. The pain came like an anchor, pulling you into an abyss of silence and desolation. The gift he had held so tightly suddenly had no purpose. The room was white, lit by cold lamps, and Miguel's body was covered by a sheet. Joan approached slowly, fearing that the sheet would move, that his grandson would get up and say that it had all been nothing more than a scare. But there was no movement. All that remained was the unshakable coldness of destiny fulfilled. "Why did I leave it for later?" he repeated like a bitter mantra. Some health professionals tried to console him, offering him water and a place to sit, but Joan seemed unable to react. The small gift, once so full of meaning, was now nothing more than a fragment of a broken dream. He found himself thinking about so many conversations they could have had. Miguel's childhood stories, the fishing moments, the games in the kitchen, the time they had spent apart in recent years. And now there was no more time. John's dazed mind took him back to old memories. He remembered when Miguel's father, his son, had passed away early, leaving him with the responsibility of being a father figure to his grandson. The feeling of duty had guided him for years, transforming Miguel into his greatest pride, the reason to get up early and take care of every detail of his livelihood. For the love of his grandson, Joan had worked late into the night, saving money to pay for his studies so that Miguel would have the chance at a better life. And on that silent night, in the hospital corridor, everything seemed in vain. When she finally returned home, she was carrying the gift in her arms, just as she had carried it to the hospital. I hadn't had the courage to leave him there. He sat in the rocking chair, which now rocked him to a rhythm of deep mourning. He opened the box, took out the watch to see its inscription. The light from the lamp reflected off the silver, revealing the words, "To Miguel, with love, your grandfather, John." It was the first and only time he held that watch out of its packaging. He had to lift the lid to make sure it was really there, that it wasn't just a nightmare. The night continued silently, each second heavier than the last. Outside, a cold wind whistled, shaking the treetops. The creaking of the house, the shadows projected on the wall, every tiny detail seemed to announce that João's life would never be the same. He closed his eyes, and all he could see was the image of Miguel as a child, running, smiling, calling him Grandpa with enthusiasm. Where had all that precious time gone? In the days that followed, John fell into a torpor. He found the strength to take care of the funeral, receive condolences from some acquaintances, but nothing seemed real. He kept his watch in his jacket pocket, as if he still intended to hand it over to Miguel at any moment. Distant family and friends came to give him hugs, but the comfort they offered did nothing to soothe the guilt that was eating away at him. And the blame in this case was not just on his grandson, but on himself for not having insisted, for not having taken the reins and demanded that final meeting. Every night, João sat in the same chair, the packaging resting on the coffee table, next to a picture frame with a photo of Miguel as a boy. In the photo, the boy was about 6 years old, smiling without a care in the world, hugging his grandfather. That moment, frozen in time, printed on photographic paper, was now a portal to souvenirs. To fill the agonizing silences, João found himself remembering every detail of Miguel's growth. She remembered the first day of school, when her grandson grabbed her hand tightly, afraid to enter the room. He remembered when he taught Miguel to swim in the dam, even though he didn't know how to swim very well. He remembered Christmas nights, when the house was filled with laughter and the smell of food, and how Miguel always received a special gift from his grandfather. With each memory, my chest hurt more. After all, now these memories were all that remained. The nights were getting longer. João could no longer sleep without being tormented by nightmares. He dreamed of a dark corridor, at the end of which he saw Miguel sitting, waiting for him. He tried to run, but he never got there. He woke up scared, feeling his breathing falter. The silence of the house suffocated him. The walls seemed to close in around him. The gift on the table was a ghost that haunted him. In the midst of this pain, João began to question himself. Could he have prevented Miguel's accident if he had been more present? If she had tried harder to talk, to pull her grandson back into family life, would anything have been different on that tragic day? The questions ate away at him, but the answers did not come. The stark reality is that time has slipped through your fingers and there is no force in the world capable of reversing it. One day, an old friend of João, Joaquim, came for a visit. Joaquim was a simple man who lived in the countryside, someone with whom João had exchanged correspondence in his youth and who had now decided to provide support in the midst of the tragedy. He found John sitting in the rocking chair, the present undisturbed on the table. Without ceremony, he sat down next to her and asked what was in the box. John, with a trembling voice, told the whole story. The friend listened in silence, respecting the pain. When João finished speaking, Joaquim put his hand on his shoulder and, with a look that was as sad as it was understanding, said, "We never imagine that we won't have another chance. We always think that tomorrow will come, that the person will be there waiting. Life, however, doesn't tell you when it ends." These words reverberated in John's heart like a distant echo, highlighting the simple and hard truth. Weeks turned into months. The once lively and bustling house became increasingly silent. João spent hours looking through photo albums, finding Miguel on every page, on every birthday, on every vacation at the farm. He found himself talking to the portrait, telling it how much he missed it, how he wished he could have said, "I love you," more often. He closed his eyes and tried to remember Miguel's voice, the exact sound of his laughter, but little by little he began to fear that his memory would fail him. In the rare moments when he left the house, João felt out of place in the world, People all seemed distracted by their own problems and routines. The city did not stop to mourn Miguel's death. The horns, the cars, the stores, everything worked as if nothing had happened. This indifference of the universe towards the pain of others was a cruel reminder that life goes on, even when our hearts are left behind. One night, dragged by his friend Joaquim, João agreed to attend a support group for bereaved people. The idea of talking about his pain publicly was uncomfortable, but he thought perhaps he could find some solace there. In the small room of a neighborhood church, several people shared stories of loss: children, husbands, wives, parents. Many were crying. João listened attentively and realized that, in a way, he was not alone. There were as many pains as there were people there. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up shakily, holding his pocket watch in one hand. He told his story, describing how he had bought the gift for his grandson but never had the chance to give it to him. He spoke of regret and guilt, of sleepless nights. As he spoke, some people sobbed in empathy because they knew what it was like to lose someone without having the chance to say their last words. In the end, João felt a small relief, as if sharing his story had lessened the weight on his shoulders. However, when he returned home, all he had to do was look at the corner of the room, see the rocking chair and the little table with the box, and all the sadness would come back. One of those days, he suddenly felt unwell. A strong dizziness made his vision go dark. João fainted, hitting his arm on the corner of the coffee table as he fell. She woke up in the hospital with a scared-looking nurse at her bedside, asking if there was anyone she could call. The question hurt more than the fall. Who to call? He had no one else around. After that, doctors recommended that he not be left alone. Joaquim tried to convince him to move to the countryside, where he would have a simple house, but at least some company. John hesitated. She knew that all she had were her memories, and that house that, although it was full of ghosts, also held the story of her life with Miguel. But the fear of being forgotten or even dying without anyone noticing was greater. On a grey afternoon, he packed his bags, placed his pocket watch inside a small velvet case, and set off with Joaquim towards a quieter life in the countryside. The interior was like a portrait of the past, a calm place without horns or commotion, where people still sat on the sidewalks to chat. For João, that meant a refuge, but also an even greater distance from what was left of his time with Miguel. For the first few weeks, he would sit on the porch of his new home, looking out at the mountains in the distance. The wind carried the smell of the countryside, of wild flowers. Here and there, a car passed by on the dirt road, raising dust. One of those late afternoons, when the sun was setting, painting the sky with dramatic colors, João took his pocket watch out of its case, opened the lid, and read the engraved words again. "To Miguel, with love, your grandfather John." A tear fell, mixing with the gentle breeze. As he stared at the horizon, he thought he heard children's laughter. Perhaps it was neighborhood children playing nearby. But João's mind soon associated the sound with the memory of his grandson. He decided to get up and walk around a bit. His legs, still shaking, carried him to the wooden gate, and he followed a dirt road, skirting a small hill that overlooked a stream. When he reached the banks of the running water, João felt the same peace he had felt when fishing with Miguel years ago. He sat on a rock and contemplated the reflection of the sunset on the surface of the stream. Time seemed to slow down there. He allowed himself to mentally relive every happy scene he had played alongside his grandson. In some, Miguel was still a scared little boy by the lake. In others, he was already a lazy teenager, dragged by his grandfather to go fishing. In this reverie, he could almost feel Miguel's presence at his side, as if his grandson were still alive, smiling as he clumsily fished. He managed to smile, but soon the harsh reality began to hurt again. He got up and walked away, trying to leave those memories at the edge of the stream, but it was impossible. Time passed, and João's routine in the countryside was limited to sporadic conversations with Joaquim, trips to the grocery store to buy supplies, and many hours in silence reflecting on life. One night, he decided to write a letter to Miguel. He knew his grandson wouldn't be able to read it, but perhaps it was a way of letting out everything that was suffocating him. He took out a pen and paper and sat down at the kitchen table. The light from the lamp illuminated the room in a soft, almost cozy way. "My dear Miguel," she began to write, her hands shaking. "I am so sorry for everything. I am sorry I was not there for you in your last moments. I'm sorry I missed the opportunities to tell you how much I loved you. I'm sorry I did not seek you out more insistently when I realized you were becoming more distant. I wanted to give you a gift, my grandson, a symbol of everything I wanted you to know about life, about the value of time, about family. But there was no time." Tears fell onto the paper, staining the ink. He continued, "If I could tell you something now, I would say, forgive me. Forgive me for not being firmer, for not pulling you away from the rush of the world for a hug. Forgive me for believing that tomorrow would always come, that there would be another chance, another day, another birthday. I never thought you would go before me, Miguel. I thought I would leave, and you would remember me fondly, but life chose another path. I love you, my grandson. I will always love you." When he finished, he read the letter aloud. With each sentence, he felt as if a little of his guilt was being released, although the sadness remained. Carefully folding the sheet of paper, he put it in an envelope, but did not write a recipient. It was a letter to the void. Still, keeping it tucked away seemed to bring some relief. In the midst of this grieving process, João began to notice that there were other ways to honor Miguel's memory. He began to talk more with young people in the neighborhood, who were interested in hearing life stories and learning about simple things from the past, such as planting a vegetable garden or repairing tools. Although he felt out of place at first, he soon discovered that some boys and girls sat around him, attentive to the stories of Mr. João, the soft-spoken man who had come from the city. Whenever he saw one of these young people distracted by their cell phones, not paying attention to those around them, João tried to show them that the present moment is valuable. He didn't want to sound bitter or resentful, but rather to pass on the lesson he had learned in the most painful way possible. And he noticed that to a small extent, some of the young people understood. They started to put their cell phones down for a few moments, paid attention to his fishing stories, and asked about the watch he carried in his pocket. "I bought this watch for my grandson," he said, showing the inscription on the back. "But I was never able to give it to him. He passed away before he received it. That's why I always tell you, don't put off until tomorrow the hug you can give today, nor the word you can say now. Life doesn't wait." These conversations, even though simple, changed something inside João. He would never get over the loss of Miguel, but he was beginning to find a purpose in sharing his experiences, in touching, even if in a subtle way, the lives of others. As if, by preventing others from making the same mistake of postponing demonstrations of love, he was honoring the memory of his grandson. One day, a boy named Daniel came to him. Daniel, about 16 years old, was shy and had conflicts with his parents. Having no one to talk to, he felt confident in João, who listened to him patiently. After much conversation, Daniel confessed that he almost never said, "I love you" to his mother, even though he was afraid of losing her. John advised him to say it while there was still time. Days later, Daniel returned, smiling, and said that by following the advice, his relationship with his mother had improved. João's eyes filled with tears, seeing there a small reflection of what could have been with Miguel. However, he felt at least a glimmer of comfort in having done something useful. In the months that followed, João became a sort of mentor to the local youth. He talked about values, about the importance of not moving away from those we love, of taking care of our family. He became a well-known, respected figure. All of this, however, did not erase the pain or the guilt. It only eased the loneliness. On certain afternoons, I would go to the stream to remember Miguel and cry discreetly. The watch remained stored away, impeccable, as if waiting for an owner who would never come. Over time, João's health deteriorated discreetly but noticeably. Age took its toll, and the emotional after-effects were also reflected in the body. He had a few episodes of high blood pressure, needed to rest for days, limited his walks around the farm, and got tired too quickly to hold long conversations. Even so, whenever he regained some strength, he would go back to talking to the young people, telling them stories. He became to them the grandfather many had never had, even though his own grandson was forever absent. The proximity of Miguel's birthday made João's heart ache. She remembered when her grandson turned 10, a simple party in the living room with homemade cake and colorful balloons. Miguel ran to his grandfather, showing him the presents, excited. Now, there wasn't even a chance to give him that last gift, that watch that symbolized how precious every second is. The day before that date, João decided he would do something special. He woke up early, grabbed a notebook, and wrote down happy memories he had with his grandson, organizing them into short chronicles. He wanted to somehow leave a record so that other people would understand the importance of valuing their loved ones while there is still time. He spent hours writing, sometimes laughing alone at some funny memories, sometimes crying. In the end, he had a small compilation of texts called For Miguel. That same day, he went to the square in the neighboring town, where a craft fair was held on Sundays. He found a small space, set up a small table, and wrote on a simple sign, "Read if you have someone you love." There he placed some copies of the short chronicles that he had printed himself at the local grocery store, and he sat down, waiting. To his surprise, many people stopped, curious, and leafed through the texts. Some read them right there and were moved, discreetly wiping away tears that were stubbornly falling. Others asked to take a copy home, saying they would read it at their leisure. João explained, without rushing, that the little book was dedicated to his grandson who never received his gift. But if anyone can learn from this story, then it was not in vain, he added. The simple initiative began to gain visibility, and soon residents from other regions began to seek out João do Relógio, João of the Clock, wanting to hear his stories. He was always kind, offering advice and repeating the greatest lesson he had learned: life ends in the blink of an eye, and no act of love should be postponed. However, the longing for Miguel did not diminish. There were days when João would wake up with his chest feeling suffocated, as if his grandson's absence were a weight of lead on his heart. One of those mornings, when he looked in the mirror, he saw his face was haggard. The wrinkles were getting deeper, and his hair was getting whiter. He felt like hugging his grandson, hearing his voice saying, "Grandpa, stop being silly." But Miguel wasn't there. To deal with this pain, he would go through the photos from album to album. And every time I found an image of Miguel smiling, it was as if I was back in that moment, almost smelling the smell, almost hearing the sounds. But I also remembered all the lost moments, all the ignored phone calls. Regret was a shadow that followed him. I should have been more insistent. I should have knocked on his door, forced a conversation, dragged him out of the house for lunch, he repeated internally. The years passed. Now João was much older. His steps were slow, but lucidity still shone in his eyes. The young people in the village were no longer so young. Some became adults, got married, had children. Even so, many visited him, grateful for the advice they once received. He kept every little thank you letter, every gift given, every photo taken with that group that, to a certain extent, had become his family. But deep down, nothing could replace the void left by Miguel. João, in conversations with Joaquim, confessed that if he had at least given the watch, he would at least have had the consolation of knowing that Miguel knew how much he was loved. However, there was no way to change the past. Time, that river that never runs backwards, had already taken Miguel away. One afternoon, after a doctor's appointment, John was diagnosed with a weak heart and would need a lot of care. He knew his days might be numbered. The news, paradoxically, didn't scare him so much. Instead, it brought a kind of acceptance. He had been blessed with years of life, albeit marked by the sadness of loss, and he had used that time to try to help others value their own relationships. Returning home, he sat on the porch. He took out his pocket watch and stared at the inscription once more. Then he took out the letter he had written to Miguel and read it again. A suppressed cry shook his chest, but he did not let it turn into a sob. He spoke softly, as if Miguel could hear him. "My grandson, I hope to find you wherever you are, and that there I can finally give you this gift." As the days went by, João's health worsened. He began to have difficulty walking and eating and spent more and more time in bed. Joaquim hired a caregiver named Fatima, a simple woman with a generous heart, who came to live in the house to help him. Fatima noticed the pocket watch on the table next to the bed and asked if it was a family gift. John smiled, a sad smile, explaining the story in a few words. She got emotional. Fatima noticed that every night João would take the watch, open it, look at the inscription, sigh and close it again as if it were a silent ritual. Moved, she decided to ask if he would like to leave a message or recording so that other people would know the meaning of that object. But John said he had already done what he could. He had shared his story with anyone who would listen. Now, all that was left was silence. One cold morning, João woke up panting. I felt pain in my chest, and my breathing was short. Fatima ran to help him and called Joaquim, who rushed him to the small health center. The local doctor did what he could, but resources were limited. They called an ambulance to take him to the hospital in the larger city, but João held Joaquim's hand and in a whisper said that he did not want to be transferred. "I think it's time to rest, Joaquim," he said, breathing heavily. "I just ask that you take care of what I left, and if you can find someone who needs a watch, who understands its value, give it to me." The friend tried to insist, but he saw in João's eyes the acceptance that only comes to those who have been carrying pain for a long time. Little by little, his breathing became weaker, while his eyes closed. At the exact moment he left, a deep silence took over the room. It was as if life had retreated, taking with it the soul of that man who had carried so much longing in his chest. Afterward, Joaquim took care of the funeral. There were not many relatives nearby. A few friends and acquaintances attended, including some of the young men he had mentored over the years. Daniel, the young man who had learned to say, "I love you," to his mother, gave a short, emotional speech about how João had saved him from a path of family estrangement. After the burial, Joaquim returned to João's house, sat on the porch, and took out his pocket watch. He looked at the inscription, remembered every conversation they had. He thought about how he would fulfill his friend's last request. "I needed to find someone who truly understood the value of time and the meaning of that gift." The thought made him smile through his tears. João, after all, could not give the watch to Miguel, but he wished that someone in the world could carry it, remembering to never postpone gestures of love. And so ended the life of João, the grandfather who had kept a gift intact, which had never been delivered in his lifetime. But his story remained in the hearts of those who heard him. When someone in that small town talked about the rush of everyday life, or about how they stopped seeing their parents and grandparents, memories of João and his watch would immediately come to mind. No one wanted to repeat the story of that man who couldn't say goodbye in time. The rocking chair, now empty, still creaked when the wind passed through the porch, as if somehow João's spirit remained there, lulled by dreams that were not fulfilled. The gift, in turn, awaited a new owner, someone who could honor it. A new chance to symbolize the message that João wanted to convey. Time does not forgive, does not wait, does not grant second chances. Somewhere, Miguel was also resting, free from the tragedies that the world imposes. And perhaps, on some unknown plane, grandfather and grandson could finally meet again. Who knows, where time does not exist, João would hand the watch to Miguel, hug his grandson, and say everything that was stuck in his throat, everything that urgency and routine prevented him from saying in life. Meanwhile, in the world of the living, the story of John and Michael remained as a powerful reminder. Don't put off until tomorrow the affection that can be shown today. Don't ignore important connections. Don't postpone meetings with those you love, because the day may come when the person is no longer there to listen, and all that will remain is regret. Thus, the narrative of the gift never delivered became a symbol of involuntary ingratitude, Miguel's for not valuing his grandfather while he could, and João's for not insisting on the meeting while there was still time. And above all, it reminded everyone of the fragility and beauty of one little word, now. If there is something you can do to say, I love you, do it. If there's a hug you can give it. If there is forgiveness to be offered, offer it. Nothing is guaranteed the next day. And so it was that, in the stillness of an evening, João's memory was immortalized not only in the rural village, but in every heart that learned of his story. Some may call it a local legend, others a chronicle of life. The fact is that the rocking chair, the pocket watch with the inscription, and the small gift package still wrapped remained as silent witnesses to everything that could have been. A narrative that echoes in the mind of those who hear it, bringing to light the most painful and necessary reflection. There is nothing sadder than the word left unsaid, and the gift that never reaches the hands of those it was intended for. This is where the story ends, but the teaching lives on. John's last words before leaving reverberate in the wind that blows across the fields. Don't wait for time to pass. Hug now, love now, give the gift now, because tomorrow may never come. End.